Let's now talk about how we collect sample data. The basics of collecting data. Let me start off with a quote. If sample data are not collected in an appropriate way, the data may be so completely useless that no amount of statistical torturing can salvage them. Statistical torturing in this sense generally means some sort of mathematical operations to the data. So we usually obtain data in one of two ways. We either conduct an observational study or we conduct an experiment. In observational study, we measure specific characteristics, but we don't attempt to modify the subjects. So this is a fly-on-the-wall approach. We're just looking at some effect taking place, but we're not actually trying to change anybody or anything. With an experiment, however, we apply some treatment and then watch the effects as they unfold. So either way, whether we're conducting an observational study or an experiment, it's important that we collect our data from a good sample. So different ways of collecting a sample are a voluntary response sample, a simple random sample, and a probability sample. Fairly common. In a voluntary response sample, the subjects decide whether or not to participate. And we generally say this is useless for making inferences about larger populations. So recall from a previous lesson when we talked about the Literary Digest poll when Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, the Literary Digest poll sent out ballots and asked people to respond. Only out of 10 million, only 2.5 million responded, which suggested that that was a voluntary response sample. So another problem with that was their sampling method. A simple random sample is where we choose n subjects in such a way that every sample size of size n has the same chance of being chosen. So for example, if we're choosing a sample of size 10 to conduct our experiment and our population has a size 100, then any group of 10 subjects from that 100 population would have an equal chance of being chosen. A probability sample is similar to a simple random sample, except instead of each group of n subjects having the same probability, each individual member has a known but probably different chance of being selected. There are other ways of choosing sample of subjects. There's one common way is a systematic sampling. There's also convenience sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. And these are used in different scenarios for different reasons. Systematic sampling is where we select a starting point and then select every kth element. So you can imagine a factory line and you have widgets coming down a factory line and you just take every 100th widget and test it. And if they're all good, then we can assume the whole batch is good, the whole population is good. Convenience sampling is where we simply use the results that are easiest to get. So for example, if I wanted to infer something about the entire population of Sierra College students, but it would be difficult for me to collect the data. So maybe, for example, maybe I'm trying to find the population, or rather the height, the average height of students at Sierra College, but it would be difficult to collect the data in, say, the summer. I might take my summer class and just ask them how tall they are and calculate the average and try to infer something about the population of the entire school. This wouldn't be the best way, but the results would be easy to get if it's the summer and I don't have any other way of polling a general student body. Stratified sampling separates the population into subgroups with similar traits and then draws a sample from each of those subgroups. So I might, for example, take the population of Sierra College students and separate them into men and women and then draw a sample from each of those subgroups. So then I could get some information about the height of men at Sierra College and the height of women at Sierra College. The cluster sampling is similar. It divides the population into groups and then picks some of those groups. But the difference is in cluster sampling, we're going to pick the entire group. So, for example, in the going with the Sierra College theme, I divide the population into, let's say, statistics classes. And then I only pick some of those statistics classes to use when I'm collecting data. So maybe I want to know the average height of students who take statistics. Well, I'd split up everybody into different statistics classes, or rather, students do that themselves, and then I'd choose maybe 3 statistics classes and get the average height from those. Again, that wouldn't be the best way to find the average. Generally speaking, we want to use a simple random sample to collect the best data, but sometimes we're not able to, for various constraints, we're not able to collect the best data, so we have to use some other method to collect data. So just looking at observational studies for a second and not experiments, we have a few different types of common observational studies. We have a cross-sectional type of study, observational study, retrospective studies, and prospective studies. And cross-sectional studies look at data where the data is observed at one point in time, and generally speaking, that's right now. So if I wanted to know how many students at Sierra College have cell phones, I would conduct the study on the population at Sierra College right now. A retrospective study is where data are collected from past observations, which is also called a case control study. So we'll look at a study coming up in a few weeks, looking at the coffee habits of several people. And what this study does is it actually takes information from a previous study, and this previous study had collected just all kinds of data from subjects, and from a lot of subjects. And so what we want to know now is, using that data, we're going to be interested in whether drinking too much coffee can cause ill health effects. And so what this current study did is take that previous study, look at all the health habits that were presented in that study and how much coffee they drank, and then ran some statistical analysis to determine if drinking too much coffee causes health problems. So we'll look at that coming up, but that's an example of a retrospective study. And a prospective study is data collected in the future from groups sharing common factors, also called a longitudinal or cohort study. So generally speaking, what we're talking about here is where we collect, generally we want to compare something that in people today versus something in people tomorrow. And a lot of times what will happen is a study will look at folks, so for example, look at some children when they're 10, and maybe suppose we're talking about cancer rates in people. So it looks at people when they're 10 and finds out how many of them have cancer, a certain type probably, and then in 10 years follows up and looks at how many of them have cancer, and then maybe follows up with them again 10 years later. So this is an example of a prospective. Now, instead of observations, let's talk about experiments. So when we're designing an experiment, a couple things to think about. First of all, randomization. This is where we assign subjects to different groups through a process of random selection. So remember, experiments are where we're applying some treatment to the group. Here with randomization, we're randomly assigning subjects to different groups. So suppose we had a treatment group and a placebo group. The treatment group gets some new drug, and the placebo group gets some placebo that doesn't or shouldn't have any effect. So we do this through randomization, or we assign the people to each group through randomization. Another thing to consider when we're designing experiments is this idea of replication. So this could mean two different things. We could repeat the experiment on more than one subject, of course, because we don't want to just leave it at one subject, but also our experiment has to be replicated, or has to have the ability to be replicated by some other independent group, some other research group. Because if it's not, if it can't be replicated, then there's going to be a lot of doubt surrounding this experiment that we've conducted and the results. Another thing to consider when we're designing experiments is this idea of blinding and double-blind experiments. So blinding means that the subject doesn't know if they're given the treatment or the placebo. Double-blind means that the doctor doesn't know who's getting the treatment or the placebo. The purpose of double-blinding is just to eliminate the possibility that the doctor knowing who's getting the treatment versus the placebo doesn't adversely or rather inadvertently affect how the subject behaves when they're given the treatment or the placebo.